Everyone's capable of change, and you can map some of these changes structurally with our tool. But whether or not they have the willingness to change is probably one of the most fundamental things that we talk about in terms of leadership development. One of the 6 areas we focus on. If they have an openness to receiving feedback and growing, then that's probably going to be more likely to mean they're going to grow as a person, and you can create intervention tools and questions you can ask them to get up that ladder. If someone is more defensive, and we call it lack of identity flexibility, then they're going to be more wedded to how they are now, and it's going to be more difficult to crack that. It is interesting to understand if someone is coachable or not using these tools. Thank you for having me. So I am an investment professional that cares a lot about how money is invested for good. So we're talking about natural capital and community impacts and things like that, just widening the aperture of what we think of as traditional return profiles. And I'm also now an entrepreneur. This is my second time around, and I'm focusing these days on leadership analytics and the power of data in helping us make better decisions around who sits in what seat, how to develop teams, and how to get people to grow more methodically with better data.
Can you walk me through the insight or like aha moment? Like leadership, I mean, you could measure like financials of a business, and that's in the way that people have done it, especially in the public markets for a long time. Like, can you kind of walk me through the origin story of like how you became so like bullish, like starting a company around measuring data behind leadership?
Yeah. So it's a couple different threads. In high school, I was really interested in becoming a psychotherapist. So I studied a little bit of Jungian, I would say psychology, but also just theory. And what came out of some of his theoretical work is the Myers-Briggs personality assessment. And so that was probably the first one I took. And then subsequently over the years, I've taken a multitude of leadership assessments, personality assessments, behavioral assessments, and some I think more insightful than others, and have been keeping that in the back of my mind. And then just making observations about leadership in different capacities. I think inspiring and visionary leaders have the potential to move markets. We see that with Steve Jobs, and we see that with Elon Musk, and we see that with all these kind of iconic entrepreneurs that have really changed the way we thought about certain industries. And we've also seen, and sometimes we don't see the counterfactual, but instances where maybe something was a great idea. We probably all had these experiences. Something was a great idea, but just couldn't get off the ground because of the team, execution, the people in charge. And so there are patterns, underlying patterns, just like with everything, that you can measure in terms of understanding someone's psychology developmentally, which is like the basis of what we are built our platform on, is this field of psychology called adult developmental psychology, which really maps someone's, along a scale, it maps someone's trajectory over time in things like their ability to handle complexity, their ability to handle pressure, their emotional resilience. And these are all factors that deeply play into leadership and your ability to perform as a leader and lead teams and such. So I found this body of work through my co-founder, and because of AI, we were excited to turn it into a set of tools that we could bring to the market.
Yeah, there's a really good like maxim that like soft skills are just hard to measure, but they are hard skills because through like charisma, like solid rhetoric, intonation in your voice, like you're able to move crowds, motivate people, make them believe in something. So learning like soft skills has always been like a way to gain an edge, to be more persuasive, influence, but it hasn't been overly indexed on because really the best way to measure it is like having, I don't know, like consultants that understand frameworks and are able to like evaluate. Myers-Briggs is a great example. Like it's like a KPI, but like being able to like measure soft skill performance, like all the leadership like skills has been, like, I think impossible, like at a reliable scale for a long time. Now, something that I've been mentioning a lot is I've been, using AI for like qualitative research, synthesis. But AI is pretty good at like measuring soft skills now, which is really exciting. Is that kind of like what you've noticed as you're playing around with it? Is like, oh wow, like we give it this framework, like this selection criteria, maybe give it like a transcript or something like that.
Yeah,
With-
I'm basically saying that we've been able to measure these factors. We go into 6 constructs. There's more we can measure, but we pulled out from the research 6 that are most relative and relevant to, directionally speaking, to positive startup outcomes. So looking at factors that showed correlations with follow-on rounds or exits, the leadership qualities that really correlated with some of those outcomes. So we drew those together. We picked 6. So while it was designed for startup founders, there's a high degree of applicability to any innovation role or roles that require a higher of complexity, leadership, or pressure, a high degree of holding a more complex job, essentially. And so there are patterns in how people speak and communicate about experiences they've had or perspectives they bring that you can map to these levels. And that was happening before with human transcript scoring. So this whole body of work was being evaluated, listening to people talk, and then scoring their transcripts by hand. So we're basically just creating that at scale at a lower cost with AI.
Okay. Yeah, and also,
Well,
yeah.
there's other things we can measure too, like obviously personality tests and then behavioral characteristics. There's a lot that AI is able to ingest, whether it's through transcript data or through forced choice or multiple choice rubrics. So it just depends on the format that people are collecting information. But I think AI is just enhancing these capabilities. And I could talk a little bit more about bias and just how it's easier to game some of those other approaches.
Yeah, well, like walking me through some of the insights. Now that you have like these tools, I mean, you're probably like dog fooding the platform yourself and, using it to, you probably run a lot of data through it, which is probably like the first time in the history where you could make it get closer to like statistical reliability of these results. Like, what were some of the big insights that came from like your early explorations with this like new platform? Like what are like the indicators of leadership readiness is kind of like how you put it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I talk about the most is that in order for someone to be fundamentally talking about a fixed versus growth mindset when it comes to human growth potential, everyone's capable of change. And you can, again, you can map some of these changes structurally with our tool. But whether or not they have the willingness to change is probably one of the most fundamental things that we talk about in terms of leadership development. So if someone is at an earlier stage of development in one of the 6 areas we focus on, if they have an openness to receiving feedback and growing, then that's probably going to be more likely to mean they're going to grow as a person. And you can create intervention tools and questions you can ask them to get up that ladder. If someone is more defensive and we call it lack of identity flexibility, then they're going to be more wedded to how they are now. And it's going to be more difficult to crack that. But it is interesting to understand if someone is coachable or not using these tools. So in a way, you can just use them as for that alone. And I think that's just meaningful information. What we're getting to with more data is just being able to correlate. What we're most excited about is, okay, where do people at different levels fit best on a team? And how do we complement those people with other people? So for instance, there was a startup founder that is extremely good at taking in feedback. He's very relationally adept. He's great at building teams and creating a sense of psychological safety, but he struggles turning that information into pivotable insight. So he tends to linger in the data collection phase or feedback phase longer than is optimal for a quick moving startup. So for him, we suggested, hey, let's get a person in here who's got a faster clip, who can help keep you accountable in making faster decisions, because the startup founder had a harmony bias. He didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. He wanted everyone to feel heard. And that's useful, but it also, you need to translate that into quicker thinking or quicker pivoting sometimes. And so those are patterns you can very concretely look at with our tool and say, okay, you need to be like paired with somebody who's better at this.
And what's your platform called?
The readiness engine.
The Readiness Engine. Yeah, like, that's interesting that you said that, like, that feedback, like, willingness to change and get and, like, almost like a hunger for feedback is, like, a strong sign of leadership, or I guess, like, maybe successful leadership traits is probably how you put it. I just finished, there's, like, this new book that just came out called Steve in Exile, which is about Steve Jobs' like, 12, like, wilderness years. I don't know if you saw that.
Mm.
That just came out as of this recording, and I just finished the audiobook because I've just been fascinated with a lot of the literature that's kind of demystifying, like, Steve Jobs. Like you mentioned, like, he generated a lot of economic value in his 40s and 50s, and like, the book Becoming Steve Jobs touches on it, like, his wilderness years a little bit, but, like, the whole thesis was that, like, he wasn't the leader that the beloved leader, like, from the get-go that we wish he was, and that, like, actually in his 20s and, like, 30s, like, he was a really bad executive. Like, there's proof he wasn't that successful. During his 30s, he was considered, like, a one-hit wonder, like, has-been. He was burning through, like, tens of millions of dollars on, like, his 2 failing businesses, and
Yeah, wow.
Next was failing until they got rid of their hardware division, just focused on software, and then they
Mm.
developed a lot of, like, the object-oriented programming principles that everyone else uses, and that's how he got back into Apple, is they sold the next operating system, which became macOS, at Apple, and then Pixar didn't, fully work until they figured out, like, the movie, like, business model and stuff like that. But it is because he was just so intense. Like, the Macintosh was, like, way ahead of its time, didn't wasn't actually commercially successful before he got kicked out at 30. But one of the things that, like the Steve Jobs in Exile, like, goes deeper into, like, the changes that he was making. Like, he became that, like, kind of leader just
Yeah.
through, like, years of eating glass. And one of the things that it calls out is that Steve learned to be, like, more hungry for feedback and being willing to, like, not try to, like, save face all the time, like, actually acknowledge that he was wrong and change his tact once he got better data. Ed
Mhm.
Catmull, who worked with him the longest, like, observed that, like, once he became, like, a father and got married, had children, he started, like, developing a lot more empathy, he coached, like, kids and stuff. Like, there was just a lot of, like, responsibility in, like, life events that eventually turned him into this person that was, like, very hungry for feedback. He's just like, "No, no, no, like, disagree with me," and, like, he wouldn't fire you if you disagreed with him. So he came back and, like, that was, like, the biggest thing is, like, being willing to, like, take feedback almost, like, at a point of, like, feeling silly and, like, looking dumb all the time so that you could get better data and, like, pivot faster. So that's really interesting that you pointed that out, is that was, like, very characteristic of, like, the Steve that turned around Apple.
Yeah, and I'm sure they actually track some of these developmental patterns in decadal increments. It depends on where you're looking on the scale and depending on the individual, how fast they move. But with coaching, you can the speed in which you're reaching some of these different points. But we all evolve over time, and who we were 10 years ago is not who we are now. And usually, if somebody has, yeah, some life changing experiences, it'll force them to either do some reflection or when in Steve Jobs' case, I'm inferring from what I've heard about him that he maybe wasn't as relationally intelligent as he was, like, cognitively sophisticated or good at holding systems in his mind and thinking in complex systems. So he would have probably scored high on the strategic complexity piece, which is one of our constructs, but lower on the relational intelligence. So you would want him surrounded by leaders that really had that maybe at a higher level so they could inform and help him shape his responses to team managerial situations or stakeholder situations that might have been more challenging. And maybe he would have, who knows, improved faster. Those are instances where it's like someone can have quite a disparity between various things that holistically come together to make someone an extraordinary leader.
Yeah, I mean, and, like, to use, like, the canonical, like, person that tempered a lot of, like, Steve's intensity, You could argue that it was his wife. But like Steve went on the record saying that he learned more about management from Ed Catmull because Ed Catmull was a
Mm,
lot older than him and was like a mentor to him and taught him a lot about like management philosophy and like how to manage creative teams.
yes.
He took those lessons and like developed like, and then he like invested in like Johnny Ive to like really drive like that creative renaissance. What I'm hearing here, and I think that's really interesting that like your diagnosis for like that one founder that you're talking about, how like the answer wasn't like, hey, round out your weaknesses. It's like bring someone else in that complements that
Yeah.
founder was your insight, because that's basically what happened to Steve. Is like Steve didn't just like become like less intense. Like he had like he ended up building a really great team that like stayed with him for the rest of his life. And so is that like like the most like the diagnosis in most cases is like, hey, maybe you just don't have someone on your team that has these like maybe scores higher on these skills, and like you should team up.
Yeah, especially when it's shorter term, like a shorter term need. Eventually, you can probably build some of that capacity yourself with interventions and coaching. But if you're needing more of a quick fix or you got to move fast on something, it's just easier to complement yourself with. But again, that coachability comes into play. You have to be coachable. So even if it's you're bringing on a complementary team member, you have to take into account what they're saying. I think it's this, we have this myth in our society of the individual. It's like it almost stems a lot of the authors that I've read that kind of hinge on this is Ayn Rand. But this idea that you're like, they're these individually brilliant humans who can solve all the problems on their own and don't really require team members to succeed. And we just live in a very individualistic culture in the US in a lot of ways. And it's so we think we have to take it on all by ourselves and solve all the problems alone. And I think this is pointing to the fact that you might just not have all of those, we call them constructs in place, but that's okay because if you have the right team members, you can be very successful. So, yeah, I think it's also up against some deep seated beliefs that we hold, and we have these myths. We create myths around individual entrepreneurs as well. Like even with Steve Jobs, you hear about Steve Jobs and then you don't hear about the people around him as much unless you dig into his biography or autobiography or if you dig a little deeper. So you just think of these individuals as like these singular brilliant minds who solved all these problems, but they had a network of people around them. So yeah, I think that's just a really important thing to keep in mind as entrepreneurs, as innovators.
Yeah, and also, well, in the book, like Steve in Exile, the last sentence of the book was that he took, and I'm gonna like paraphrase it, but it was really good. He was just like he finally like it's when he finally like took over Apple again, became like the CEO, but like learned all these lessons over like 12 years of just eating glass, and basically said that like, hey, now he like was in the driver's seat, he was the CEO of Apple, and this time he was ready. Like where he did like and the quote that really like tied all together for me was Steve saying like, there's this like paradigm shift. Like I just thought like, when I used to think that like being the CEO is top of the pyramid and everyone's here working to like help build your vision, and that manifests in like very overbearing, micromanagey like leadership where he's just trying to like push people to like meet his vision and like scare them and use like fear tactics. And he says like you get to a point where like it flips and you realize like the CEO, their job is to work for everybody else and like bring out the best in other
Yeah, I love
people.
that.
Yeah, and that was like his core leadership philosophy is like he let other people do demos. He basically just provided very strong like strategic direction and like selection criteria, like, and then gave people executives like Johnny and all the whole rogues gallery, Tony Fidel, the like creative control, and then his job was just to like work to make sure that they were doing their best work. I do think that a lot of the evidence that you're seeing and your data, and if you're willing to be like me and read the 5 different biographies so that you could understand the different angles of a person's life, is that the evidence doesn't really support like the lone genius. Like
Yeah.
I'm not very convinced in that like mythos or mythology, so to speak, is that they can be really smart 20-year-olds, but you realize that they didn't start really getting successful until they're like towards like their 40s because they
Yeah.
probably had to learn a lot of interpersonal relationship skills because like it's hard to make a team when you're making like talented people feel small. They could just find a job somewhere else.
Yeah.
So it's like you look at like employee retention, those are like numbers like Steve had terrible retention like for until he was like 40 and then the E team that he had towards Apple years, like they stayed until he died. And
And I know it's fascinating. It's really cool that you bring him in as an example because it's good to look at these cases. In business school, we learn through case studies, and it's like you can't really unpack some of the work that we're doing without understanding cases and just how they're applied to actual outcomes in business. And one of the things we're trying to improve is execution risk and reducing employee turnover and helping teams work more in concert with one another to improve employee sentiment just about engagement. Those are all factors that are very tangible and focused on the business side of things. You don't want to It's one thing to talk about psychology in an abstract way, the importance of growth and all that, and then you also have to apply it concretely into business. People have to make business decisions from this information. So we've tried really hard to draw some of those connections, and we're only getting better at, again, like what I was saying, drawing connections between what this level means and what it correlates to in terms of role that should be played or supporting teams that need to be put around the individual. There's this researcher called Jacques. I forget his first name, but he wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations, and he actually looks at the levels of development and where people sit best within an organization, like functionally, as a correlation with some of these developmental capacities. So there's been some work done there, but I think we're in an era where we just have access to so much more data, and we're going to start to really get granular in terms of creating teams, bringing people in who need to complement other people, helping people grow more effectively and specifically. So, yeah, I'm just really excited about the period. And then something I wanted to say earlier that you alluded to is that one of the markers of a higher level of development is that you're actually creating systems around yourself so that you're not the sole, like especially if you're a startup founder or CEO, you don't want to just be the point person for everything. And so a lot of the markers of higher stages of development is you're actually creating resilience. For instance, if you're talking about emotional resilience, you have systems in place to handle stress. That might be a cohort of people you call when you really need help with a decision. It might be breathing exercises. It might be mindfulness meditation. You just have it. You have a sense of indicators when things are getting stressful, and you know how to respond accordingly. With the strategic complexity, you have built frameworks and you have an understanding of which frameworks are helpful to you in different situations, and you can move between them objectively. And you see yourself as part of a bigger system. And so when you're taking in feedback, which relates to coachability, you see the feedback as just one point in the system. You don't take it personally as related to you as an individual. And so these are all just markers of systems and improving the systems around yourself so that you and the thing you're working on can grow.
yeah, I've noticed like I mean, it also just was a lot of stress inoculation. I'm a trained designer, and a big part of like the design profession is critique. And if you go to design school, your job is to basically just churn out a large body of work to get the bad work out of your system and like develop your taste. And then you have to go through something called critique, where like you're consistently getting your work torn apart by your peers. And the whole purpose of like critique in design school, but like it's also like a part of most design teams at startups or companies is to like at first it's to like break down the sense of you could do it all by yourself. Like, you know, you need to trust your teammates' feedback. Like you have to, it's basically stress inoculation to like develop better feedback loops. To be and the best designers are really good at like taking feedback and like editing, like choosing what to ignore and choosing what to apply. You could see it with like really good stand-up comedians that like you see like the hour-long special that every joke lands, everything's funny, but you don't see the thousands of like Tom Segura. He was just on a great podcast, really actually about like the craft of like taking feedback is how I write.
Hmm. Oh,
Um,
yeah.
higher
I
rate.
haven't looked into it, but that's, I've heard
Yeah,
of it,
you've
and I'm
probably seen
so
clips.
nervous.
Yeah, like How I Write's really great because Tom Segura was on it, and he was like, when you see like a show and every joke's landing, that comedian at a minimum probably has done that whole set 200 times before they did the big stadium, and it was it's 200 times in front of like a real audience. It could be a dive bar or like a other, like or in front of other comedians where you're getting feedback from your peers or from the audience. And if the joke doesn't land and no one laughs, it's not the audience's fault. It's the comedian's fault. And so then they're like evaluating, like, was it delivery? Was it maybe I took the wrong hook? Okay, let me try that again the next night. Developing this sense of like just relentless feedback. Um, eventually you get to a point where you're just developing systems. Like the system is like a critique meeting, right? Or like
Yeah.
at Amazon, the system is like a peer, like a 6-page like strategy memo meeting where they have to. The ritual is everyone has to read the VP's memo for the next first 20 minutes silently, and then like the rest of the meeting is a discussion around that document, and they're critiquing the pros about like a strategy. That's like the new wrinkle in my brain. Like it's kind of clicking for me based off what you said. Is like, oh yeah, like I didn't get good at taking feedback until like I gave myself to the process of like critiques or like review meetings where it's like a dedicated time. Like you can mentally shift. Like the whole purpose is to like have my work scrutinized.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's very akin to what we're talking about is developing systems in which you're growing, and if you just stay in isolation and you're just in your own head with your problems or the systems that you got brought up with and you have a fixed mindset around that, it's really difficult to penetrate. I think penetrate's a good word. You have to literally create a semi-permeable boundary between you and the outside world to receive feedback and grow with that and internalize it and not let it derail you. Or most resistance to change comes from the emotional body. If you actually talk to people in coaching situations, it's an interesting phenomenon, but often resistance comes up before change happens. And so if you can push through that resistance and the uncomfortableness of it, you often get to a better place. But that emotional resistance comes up for everybody. It's just that those that have created systems around themselves are more comfortable with it and are used to it. It's like weight training. It's always uncomfortable, but you have to get used to what that discomfort feels like.
Yeah, and like in the weight training example, like strength comes from tearing the muscle, and I think like leadership, like emotional maturity, comes from tearing the ego. Not getting rid
Yeah.
of it, not getting rid of the ego. Like the ego's super valuable when harnessed, but like enough where like you don't have a flight or fight response when you're giving critical feedback or you have a tough conversation because you're extracting your identity, I guess, like the self from the work, and that like the work's the most important thing. I guess like there's not a lot of other easy examples. I'm just gonna have to keep like throwing money in the apple jar and keep bringing up Steve Jobs, but like if you read the book Creative Selection, you could see how like it was about the original iPhone project and like how they made the iPhone, and it was written by like a
Mhm.
principal engineer who worked on the keyboard. And Steve institutionalized this culture of like demos where like your job is to make artifacts of work and like rapidly show it to your peers in like leadership,
Yeah.
and then and eventually it would get to him like first demoed your team and they're like, oh, this is good, let's show it to like the director of the project, and then the director is the gatekeeper to decide if it goes up to the VP level, and then the
Mhm.
VP decides which demos make it to Steve, and so every feature in the iPhone eventually made it to Steve, and it was just kind of like the pressure cooker of like working in that space was like, okay, cool, like maybe the demo didn't go so well, you got like feedback, but the expectation was that you're supposed to like go back to the drawing board, iterate again, bring it back for another demo, and like you don't have a choice. Like if you're the responsible individual, you have to like try again, because as long as they believe in the idea, like we'll figure out the solution. And what I've noticed is cultures that like don't have very strong outcomes of innovation is like there is no critique culture, like, or demo
Yeah.
culture. It's like you have to come polished, you have to like manage optics,
I
and
think that's really profound culture. There's cultural differences as to openness to, um, coachability, identity, flexibility, innovation. Yeah, there's a bunch of cultural and personal and demographic considerations for sure. So I think it's important to not lose sight of those. But I also think people of any background can come to a growth mindset. I very much believe that. But yeah, I think that you have to create a culture as a leader of these things as well. So you have to develop them within yourself, and then you have to create a culture of that. And when people talk about building culture, it's stemming from the people typically at the top. So if they don't have this mindset of, let's call it coachability, that's unlikely to trickle down, or it's going to be uncomfortable for people to develop that at other levels. So you just have this whole systematic fixed mindset that emerges in a business. And so these are all things you can trace. And it becomes really fascinating in large companies or in with bigger data sets where you really can pinpoint, okay, where is this um how coachable are these people? And then, like, why has this culture developed around maybe people feel fearful or they don't feel like they can speak their mind? Those are all things that stem from things like coachability.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that. So walk me through like how a customer of your platform would incorporate like your platform into their operations. Who are you usually like talking to when you're trying to like implement the system?
Yeah. Because we're looking at growth stage companies in industries that are highly innovative.
Yeah.
And we're speaking to either the C suite or the CHROs. Kind of depends on who I get connected with. But either way, we want to help innovative high growth companies with understanding promotion cycles, with understanding team construction, with understanding patterns that might be preventing execution from happening. These are all use cases for us, succession planning. And so we can really come in a variety of different ways, but we like to say we're augmenting human decision making. So we're not trying to come in and say, don't listen to your gut instinct, listen to this people analysis that we have to offer. It's more like you might have a sense about a person, there's a promotion coming up, and we can help give you some extra pattern recognition and data to inform your decision making process. And it's very much augmenting human decision making. And then there's role playing we can do, there's coaching. Tactically, what we're doing is we're either taking transcript data from everyday communications, like we can take call notes or presentation meeting notes, and we can do this analysis. Or we can have people sit down and take a 45-minute assessment. Those are customizable, but we have some that are just off the shelf. And it's a one-way video interview where people answer scenario and open-ended questions. And why that's important is it's difficult to game. So I said that before. It was like a lot of the leadership assessments are fixed or forced choice or multiple choice. And these days you can kind of go online and to AI and be like, how do I answer this to be a INTJ? Or how do I answer this to have this outcome? And so this one's a lot more difficult to game. And another thing that you're getting is a negative space analysis. So what does that mean? It means you're hearing what the person says and we're running analytics on that, but also what's missing. So say that you're hiring a person or promoting someone for a sales role or a business development role. If they never mention relational intelligence or anything related to empathy or putting themselves in someone else's shoes during transcript or assessment, we're flagging that as something to pay attention to. Like it's not, again, it's not good or bad, but we're just saying,
It's
is
not a
this
judgment.
person, yeah, it's just like this person didn't mention the relational side of things. And that's probably important for this particular sales or BD role. So those are just some other like interesting dimensions of this.
Okay. So there's kind of like an element of like forward deployed engineering where there is like consult like advisory
Yeah.
services on top of like putting data into like your proprietary system.
Yeah.
And so this would be like so growth stage companies means like that the makeup of the leadership team is going to be changing rapidly. This is usually like Series C, right? Like in the
Yeah. I'd say like even B onwards. And you get to the point where we also work with private equity and growth equity as
Okay.
well, because as you get up to certain levels of company, we can still work with those, but we think that like focusing on highly innovative, high growth, highly complex type of industries or business models is where we thrive because of that ability to measure complexity and high pressure and kind of resilience under pressure and ability to pivot. Those are all markers that are more relevant in those circumstances.
What I've noticed, like working in a couple of Series C startups in my career, is that that's kind of like the make or break point. That's usually like when like the CEO gets it like exited if they're not, delivering results after a certain amount of time. Like it's such a fragile part, like
Yeah.
developmental stage, and so that makes a lot of sense that you'd probably come in around that time because this is exactly when you're deciding like, hey, should I bring in like a real CFO or like bring in like a chief revenue officer or should they report to me? Like asking a lot of those questions is really valuable in that stage because there's no one size fits all because the founder and the executive team in a growth stage company is so different every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so and it's also just a function of go-to-market strategy and don't wanna boil the ocean, but, yeah, you said it well. That's exactly right. So,
I mean, yeah, I could geek out about this for a while, but like this kind of go into like the last line of questioning. I mean, I'm very optimistic about the future. Like AI's ability to like measure like the soft skills and like signals of like gaps and like communications and leadership capabilities is fantastic and it's only going to get better. I was thinking, I'm like, yeah, there probably should be like a lot of startups that like are going to start like measuring this kind of data, and I guess you're evidence of that. Logan, what do you feel like there's anything that hasn't been said that should be said before we sign off?
yeah, I think we've covered a lot. I've noticed if you look at historical innovations that often people think about solutions at the same time. There's more ancient examples of this, like when with pyramids cropping up at around the same time all over the world, all the way to various inventors coming up with the same invention. Then it just depends on who gets there first in terms of patenting and go to market. So I think a lot of people, like you said, are on this wavelength of there's better ways to analyze people analytics than used to be the case. And we're moving into this era where I think we'll see more patterns coming out that will help illuminate the future of leadership and team development. And so we can see that as a negative thing, or we can see that as a hybridized information structure, which is the way I see it, where you still listen to your gut instinct, you still confer with your colleagues, you still have some of the same human decision making factors, but you're just bringing in a technology that arguably can look at bigger patterns of data at greater speed, at lower cost, and using that as a competitive advantage in business. So I see that reality emerging. And I think more and more people will as well. So I think it's an exciting time to be building a people analytics company. And I'm excited to also have run into some other complementary tools. And I'm just totally becoming a huge fan of this space.
Yeah, and I mean, sure. Like, I'll just tie like one loose end. So your career has tripping over
The
my words
investing
here.
world. Yeah, impact
Yeah,
investing.
you're in the investing world where it's capital allocation, and there's a lot of famous stories. Warren Buffett back in the '60s, he would hire. This is a real old version of people analytics. He'd hire private investigators to do background checks on CEOs he was evaluating for companies he was like going to
Hmm.
buy and say, okay, the CEO could talk about financial responsibility, but they're driving a red sports car outside of work. And like,
Okay. Gruen are they yeah.
yeah, exactly. Right. Like, even like Warren Buffett, who's like a very big numbers guy, he was evaluating the character of like the leadership of the companies
With
he
the
was.
analytics he had at the time. Yeah. Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people have piecemealed some of this, but we just are living in an era where there's so much more possible. So
Yeah. And that you could evaluate like investments based off of like the reputation of someone. Like, there's just so much data out there where you can measure like leadership reputation and like, well, what other employees say about them. Like, you could do a deep research report with like AI. No, yeah. I mean, I don't want to keep like running over a point here, but super cool and excited to see what you
yeah,
guys do with your
thank you.
platform. Logan, how can people find your work? Like, what's the best way to reach out to you and engage with your company? And we'll go from
Yeah,
there.
our website is readinessengine.io, and there's a contact form there, or you can email me at logan@founderrl.com. And so, yeah, readinessengine.io is probably the easiest way through the contact form.
All right, Logan, thank you so much for coming on the show. You have a good one.
Thank you.
Hey, listener, thanks again for listening to The Way of Product. As we power down today's session on the fusion of creativity and technology, let's solidify the energy you've gotten from our dialogue today. If you've gleaned insights or strategies that could turbocharge your projects, I have a small but powerful ask. Swing by the platform where you're hearing this and leave a review. Think of it as your digital high five to us. It's a fuel that propels this content to more creative technologists like you, amplifying the impact of the shared knowledge. So until our next interview, keep pioneering and pushing the envelope. Thanks again for lending your ears and your imagination to our community. Catch you on the next download.